Hello and welcome to Global with me, Matthew Amroliwala. You might see it as a triumph for the little guy, a backlash against Edward Snowden's revelations of widespread internet spying by US intelligence agencies. Or you might see it as a disaster for the smooth processing of our information online. Whatever your view, today's ruling from the European Court of Justice is very significant. Basically, it says that firms operating in Europe can now be barred from transferring private consumer data to the United States in the way they have for years. The ruling centres on the so-called Safe Harbour Agreement, which provided an agreed method for companies to smoothly transfer personal data from Europe to the US. An Austrian privacy campaigner, Max Schrems, has successfully argued that EU citizens have no protection against US surveillance efforts once their information is transferred. His David and Goliath legal action targeted the tech giant Facebook, but its impact goes even wider. There are more than 5,000 US companies that make use of this arrangement. So now what? Are we left in some sort of legal limbo? Well, the European Commission has confirmed the EU is now renegotiating its data transfer agreement with the United States.
We will provide guidance to national data protection authorities to ensure a coordinated response on alternative ways to transfer data. This is important for European businesses. We will also continue our discussions with the United States. Let me remind you that following the Snowden revelations in 2013, the Commission had identified the shortcomings of the Safe Harbour arrangement and had made 13 concrete recommendations on how to make the Safe Harbour safer. This has been acknowledged by the court ruling. Since 2013, we've been working hard with the American authorities to revise the Safe Harbour, and we have made important progress that we can now build on in light of the judgment.
Well, that was the European Commission. Now, just before we came on air today, I spoke to Max Schrems, himself the student who brought this case to the European Court of Justice.
Pretty much all the points we brought up were taken by the European Court of Justice, and they joined us in the views we expressed. And generally, I just have the feeling it's a huge step for this whole debate on mass surveillance, not just for US mass surveillance, but also, for example, what's done in the UK, because this ruling may be just a landmark that will also be relevant if cases, for example, reach Strasbourg for European surveillance. And the other thing is that privacy is really enforced now, because so far the general idea of the industry was you can break all these privacy laws in Europe and nothing is going to happen. If you have judgments by top courts, you probably have a little more pressure now.
What did you fear was happening or potentially could happen?
As the court has found, this data is directly used by the NSA and can be used against you. There are cases reported starting from like average people that tweeted the wrong thing and suddenly got pulled off the plane, to like more severe issues of people that are, I don't know, political activists, stuff like that. That rely on trustworthy communication tools, and that's basically the issue that you should be able to trust if you communicate with other people online, just like you're typically able to trust if you're on the phone or if you send a letter. But right now that's not the case, and that's something that concerns many people as well as me.
For those that oppose you, what is wrong with their basic premise that says as terrorists get more sophisticated, so the security services also need to get more sophisticated, and today's ruling may help to maintain privacy but does nothing to actually help all of our safety?
Yeah, the main question in this case is really not about how sophisticated surveillance is, but if it's mass surveillance, pretty much surveilling people that did nothing wrong, just pretty much suspect anybody in the world that they could be a potential terrorist. And that's the big difference in approach, that most people in the privacy field say, yes, you should be able to surveil, I don't know, communication in general, but only targeted and only if there is a reason. And that's the big issue, and that's the big difference of approaches. And I think it's reasonable to say that the government has nothing to sniff around in my private stuff as long as I didn't do anything wrong, and as long as there is no real reason to believe that I did wrong.
Well, that was the reaction from the man who brought this case, won this case. Nuala O'Connor is the president of the Centre for Democracy and Technology, which advocates stronger controls on government surveillance of the internet. She's there in our Washington studios. Welcome to our global programme. How important is this ruling, do you think?
This is an incredibly important ruling, and it's an incredibly important day in the long-standing dialogue between the U.S. and the EU on data transfers by companies and surveillance in the government space.
Who will be affected most, do you think? Individuals, companies, security services, the law?
Well, the real fact of this ruling is that it actually destabilizes the commercial space more than it destabilizes government surveillance opportunities and activities. So that's the limitation of what's happened today. But I think the court has sent a very strong signal to governments, not just the United States government, but governments around the world, that a ubiquitous surveillance society is not what we're going to tolerate as individuals wherever in the world we live. It's surprising that I'm not more joyous about this ruling, because it does, again, send a very important signal about surveillance, but it does destabilize legitimate data transfers. And it's important to note, this is not just about internet and website companies. This is any company doing business on both sides of the Atlantic that needs to transfer data about employees, customers, vendors. And so small and medium enterprises are actually being affected today, probably more than the big guys who have the ability to do other opportunities like binding corporate rules or model contracts.
So where does
I worry in the short term.
Yeah, where does it leave them then, do you think?
They are scrambling, I think, today to find other ways to comply with European law. And we do want to see, obviously, parties on both sides of the Atlantic in compliance with the laws that protect the privacy of individuals. Where it really should be scrambling are the governments, because this is a government-to-government dialogue, and we need to solve for those issues. And that's the dialogue that needs to speed up and happen quickly.
We were hearing there from the man who actually brought the case. I mean, when it comes back to individuals, how much should individuals worry about how their data is being used? Do we even know how their data is being used?
Well, that is the principal message of the Snowden revelations, that not only was there more ubiquitous bulk surveillance in the United States and elsewhere, but that people weren't aware of it. Now today we see polling numbers on both sides of the Atlantic that show that the vast majority, 60, 70, 80% of Americans and Europeans are very concerned and actually don't know what to do about it. And that's why we're calling on governments, again, both sides of the Atlantic, not just the U.S., but around the world, to limit and reform surveillance and to provide only, as Max already said, the most targeted, limited surveillance of suspected criminals.
In his latest BBC interview that he gave yesterday, or that was aired yesterday, Edward Snowden talks of GCHQ having the capacity to turn people's smartphones on and to listen in. I wonder, given all that we're talking about, whether there's an assumption that somehow in Europe there is more data protection than there is in the United States. That may be a misapprehension.
Thank you for recognizing that, because in reality that's true. Having worked in the U.S. government and having been part of the U.S.-EU dialogue and really the global dialogue on surveillance and counterterrorism, we recognize that there are people who want to do harm to citizens around the world, and we want our governments to have the legitimate, limited tools to keep us safe. But the fact is, surveillance happens around the world and on both sides of the Atlantic, and what we've seen is that Snowden revelations revealed both sides of the Atlantic have some reform needed.
So what, briefly, do you anticipate replacing this agreement that actually has the chance of working?
So in the short term, the Safe Harbor 2.0 deal has been in the works for months and months, and we hope that both sides will come to the table and respect and actually recognize the very real concerns citizens around the world have about ubiquitous mass surveillance. In the long term, I really hope for omnibus federal laws in many, many countries, not only the United States, that limit the intrusion of the government on our daily lives. The most ordinary things, as you point out, cell phones, our smart homes, our smart cars, will be transmitting more and more data about us in the years and decades ahead. We need to put in place strong protections now to defend our privacy.
Well, we shall see if that comes. Nuala O'Connor, thank you so much for being with us and talking to us here on today's Global programme. Thank you. Now, other news.